Most empaths never actually awaken. They move through life absorbing everything around them, other people's moods, tensions, unspoken pain, and they call it a gift. But privately, it doesn't feel like a gift. It feels exhausting. It feels confusing. It feels like being constantly overwhelmed by things you can't explain and can't control. You walk into a room and something shifts in your body before anyone even speaks. You leave conversations feeling drained without knowing why. You carry emotions that don't fully belong to you, yet you can't separate them. And over time, you start asking a quiet question you can't quite articulate. If this is a gift, why does it feel like a burden? But here's what most people don't understand. That state, the emotional flooding, the lack of boundaries, the constant overwhelm, that isn't the final form of empathy. It's the undeveloped stage. It's what empathy looks like before transformation. Because a small number of empaths go through something entirely different. Not a temporary realization, not a spiritual high, not a moment of clarity that fades after a few days. What they go through is structural, a deep psychological transformation that changes how their consciousness operates at its core. Carl Jung encountered these individuals throughout his work, though he struggled to fully explain them within the limits of traditional psychology. These weren't people who simply became stronger or more resilient. In many cases, they had been through intense psychological pressure, childhood environments that demanded constant emotional awareness, relationships that stripped away their identity, prolonged periods of inner darkness that forced them to confront themselves without escape. What Jung observed was not recovery in the conventional sense. These individuals didn't come out of their experiences hardened or numb. They came out different. Their sensitivity didn't disappear, it evolved. Where they once absorbed everything, they now perceived with precision. Where they once felt overwhelmed, they now understood what they were sensing. The same empathic system that once caused confusion became refined into something far more accurate, far more controlled, and far more powerful. Jung noted that this transformation only occurred after something critical, the integration of the shadow. Before this, empaths couldn't distinguish between their own internal material and what they were picking up from others. Everything blended together into one continuous emotional experience. But once those internal layers were faced, once the unresolved wounds, suppressed emotions, and unconscious patterns were brought into awareness, the entire system reorganized. The empath was no longer porous in the same way. Their perception sharpened, and what emerged from that process was not the version of empathy most people are familiar with. It was something else entirely. Today, we're going to break down the 5 specific abilities Jung observed in these awakened empaths, why they only develop after real transformation, how they function in everyday life, and how to recognize whether they're already active in you. Because once this shift happens, your relationship with reality itself changes. The first ability Jung identified in awakened empaths is what can best be described as energetic discernment. At the surface level, this might sound similar to what most people already associate with empathy, the ability to feel what others feel. But Jung made a very clear distinction here. What unawakened empaths experience is not discernment, it's absorption. They walk into a room and immediately become influenced by whatever emotional atmosphere is present. If there is tension, they feel tense. If there is sadness, they feel heavy. If there is anxiety, their body starts reacting before their mind even understands why. There is no separation between what belongs to them and what belongs to others. But awakened empaths operate differently. They walk into that same room and instead of being overwhelmed, they begin to read it. It's no longer a flood, it's a map. They can sense multiple emotional currents at once, but instead of merging with them, they differentiate them. They know which feeling belongs to which person. They can identify subtle contradictions, someone speaking confidently while carrying insecurity underneath, someone smiling while holding suppressed grief. This is not guesswork. It is perception refined to a level where emotional information becomes structured rather than chaotic. Jung observed that this ability only emerges after deep internal work, particularly shadow integration. Before that, the empath's internal world is too unresolved to act as a stable reference point. Their own unprocessed emotions interfere with what they perceive externally, creating distortion. But once they confront themselves fully, once they recognize their own wounds, projections, and patterns, the interference begins to disappear. What remains is clarity. They can feel without absorbing. They can sense without losing themselves. They can read the emotional architecture of a space without becoming part of it. And this precision is what makes the ability so powerful. An awakened empath doesn't just notice that something feels off. They can identify exactly what is off, where it's coming from, and often why it exists. They might sit in a meeting and immediately recognize that the most enthusiastic person in the room is masking anxiety about their position. Or attend a gathering and sense which connections are authentic and which are maintained out of obligation. Jung noted that individuals with this level of discernment were often accurate to a degree that made others uncomfortable. Not because they were making bold claims, but because they quietly knew things that hadn't been openly expressed. They were reading what existed beneath behavior, beneath words, in the space between people. And once this ability develops, it changes how you move through the world. You stop relying solely on what people say and begin trusting what you perceive. Now, the second ability Jung described builds directly on this foundation. He referred to it as shadow sight. Every person carries aspects of themselves. They have rejected traits, impulses, emotions, or tendencies that don't fit their self-image. These aspects don't disappear. They move into the unconscious, where they continue influencing behavior from behind the scenes. Most people are unaware of their own shadow. They experience its effects, but they don't recognize its source. And because they can't see it in themselves, they can't see it clearly in others either. But awakened empaths develop a different relationship with this layer of the psyche, because they have already confronted their own shadow. They have faced the parts of themselves they didn't want to acknowledge: anger, jealousy, manipulation, fear, the need for control, the capacity to hurt or withdraw. They didn't bypass these traits or suppress them. They examined them, understood them, and integrated them. And through that process, they developed the perceptual vocabulary to recognize the same patterns in others. This is what Jung meant by shadow sight. It's not about judging people or analyzing them from a distance. It's about perceiving the full structure of who someone is, both what they show and what they hide. An awakened empath might listen to someone speak with confidence and still perceive the insecurity driving their behavior. They might notice controlling tendencies and immediately recognize the underlying fear of abandonment. They might observe perfectionism and understand the shame that fuels it. They are not just seeing actions, they are seeing the psychological forces behind those actions. And this perception is not something they can turn on and off. Once developed, it becomes part of how they experience every interaction. Jung pointed out that this ability makes awakened empaths extremely difficult to manipulate, because manipulation depends on surface-level perception. It relies on the assumption that the other person will respond to what is being presented without questioning what lies underneath. But when someone can see the underlying motive, the insecurity behind the charm, the strategy behind the guilt, the intention behind the behavior, the manipulation loses its effectiveness. They are not reacting to the performance. They are aware of the mechanism, and awareness disrupts control. The third ability Jung documented is what he called temporal pattern recognition. This is where empathic perception extends beyond the present moment. Most people evaluate situations based on what is immediately visible. They interpret events as they unfold, reacting to what has already happened. But awakened empaths begin to perceive something different, the trajectory. They recognize patterns early, often before there is enough external evidence for others to see them. They sense where a dynamic is heading, not because they are predicting the future in a mystical sense, but because they are reading the underlying structure that produces consistent outcomes. Jung emphasized that this ability is rooted in pattern recognition, not intuition in the vague sense the word is often used. It develops from years of observing human behavior under emotionally charged conditions. Many empaths, especially those who grew up in unstable environments, learned early on to anticipate shifts in mood, tone, and behavior as a way to maintain safety. They studied micro-expressions, subtle changes, inconsistencies, often unconsciously. Before awakening, this skill is tied to survival. But after transformation, it expands. It is no longer limited to detecting threat. It becomes the ability to recognize patterns across time. An awakened empath might meet someone and sense immediately how that person's relationships tend to unfold. They might observe the early stages of a project and recognize the behavioral patterns that will determine its outcome. They might watch interactions between people and understand the long-term dynamics being formed beneath the surface. And often, this awareness arrives before anything observable confirms it. That's what makes it difficult, because you see what is coming, but you cannot always prove it. Jung noted that this ability can be isolating, not because it is inaccurate, but because it operates ahead of shared awareness. You may sense that a relationship is deteriorating, while everyone involved believes everything is fine. You may recognize a pattern of self-sabotage in someone who is currently succeeding. And when you try to express what you see, it is often dismissed not because it's wrong, but because it's early. So you learn to hold that perception internally, to watch patterns unfold in real time, often exactly as you recognized they would. And over time, this reinforces something fundamental. You begin to trust your perception, even when it doesn't align with what others can see yet. At this point, something shifts, because these three abilities, energetic discernment, shadow sight, and temporal pattern recognition, start to work together. You are no longer just sensing emotions. You are understanding people at a structural level. You are reading the present, the hidden, and the direction all at once. And that changes how you relate to everything. But according to Jung, this is only the beginning of the transformation, because the next two abilities move beyond perception into direct interaction with the deeper layers of the psyche. The fourth ability Jung described is where empathic perception crosses a threshold. It is no longer just about observing or understanding what exists within other people. It becomes something more active, more immediate. Jung referred to this as unconscious communication. At first glance, this can sound abstract, even mystical, but Jung was precise in how he framed it. He did not describe it as mind reading or supernatural influence. He described it as a psychological phenomenon that emerges when one individual has achieved a sufficient level of inner integration. When an awakened empath interacts with someone, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Their presence itself creates a kind of psychological environment, one that the other person's unconscious responds to, often without their awareness. This is why people behave differently around them. You may have noticed this in your own experience. Even before understanding it, people tell you things they don't normally share. Conversations move quickly from surface level to deeply personal without any deliberate effort on your part. Someone you just met begins revealing fears, regrets, or memories they have never spoken out loud before. And you didn't ask for it. You didn't guide the conversation there. It simply emerged. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. He noticed that certain individuals, particularly those who had gone through deep psychological integration, seemed to act as catalysts for the unconscious material of others. When they were present, defenses softened, masks slipped, suppressed emotions surfaced. But why does this happen? Jung's explanation was grounded in the structure of the psyche itself. When someone has confronted their own shadow, when they have faced the parts of themselves they once rejected, they develop a kind of internal stability. They are no longer threatened by the darker or more uncomfortable aspects of human nature because they have already encountered them within themselves. And the unconscious of others recognizes this, not consciously, not through logic, but at a deeper level. It senses that this is a space where what has been hidden can exist without immediate rejection or judgment. So it begins to express itself, sometimes through words, confessions, stories, admissions that seem to come out of nowhere, sometimes through emotion, tears, anxiety, relief that the person cannot fully explain, sometimes through behavior, sudden shifts in tone, vulnerability, or openness that feels uncharacteristic. The awakened empath does not force this process. In fact, they cannot. Their role is not to direct what emerges, but to hold space for it. This is where many people misunderstand the nature of this ability. They assume it gives them responsibility for what surfaces in others. That if someone opens up, they must guide them, fix them, or carry their process forward. Jung warned strongly against this, because the moment the empath begins to take ownership of another person's unconscious material, they re-enter the same dynamic they once lived in: over-identification, emotional entanglement, and eventual exhaustion. Unconscious communication is not about becoming a healer in every interaction. It is about becoming a presence that allows truth to surface. And there's a difference. An awakened empath learns to witness without absorbing, to listen without taking on, to allow expression without feeling responsible for resolution. This creates a paradox in how others experience them. People feel drawn to them because something real emerges in their presence, but they may also feel uncomfortable, even unsettled, because what emerges is not always easy to face. Relief and discomfort exist at the same time. And this dynamic often defines the relationships awakened empaths experience. They become mirrors, not intentionally, but by nature. Their presence reflects what others have been avoiding. Now, the fifth ability Jung identified moves even deeper. It expands beyond individual psychology and into something collective. He called this archetypal perception. To understand this, we need to step into one of Jung's central ideas, the collective unconscious. According to Jung, human beings do not only carry personal experiences in their psyche, they also carry inherited patterns, universal structures of meaning that have existed across cultures and time. These patterns, which he called archetypes, shape how we experience life at a fundamental level. The mother, the orphan, the hero, the shadow, the rebirth. These are not just symbolic ideas. They are psychological frameworks that organize human experience beneath conscious awareness. Most people live within these patterns without recognizing them. They experience heartbreak, conflict, transformation, loss, but they interpret these events only at the personal level. But awakened empaths begin to perceive something else. They see the pattern behind the experience. They recognize when someone is not just going through a breakup, but is moving through the archetype of loss and rebirth. They see when a person's struggle is not random, but part of a larger psychological process that has unfolded in countless lives before. They begin to perceive the mythic dimension of everyday life. This does not remove the personal reality of what is happening. It deepens it. For example, When an awakened empath encounters someone in deep suffering, they feel the pain. That does not disappear, but alongside the pain, they also perceive the structure of transformation embedded within it. They recognize that something is ending and something else is trying to emerge. That recognition changes how they respond. They are less likely to panic in the face of emotional intensity because they understand its place within a larger process. They can hold space for grief without needing to immediately resolve it. They can sit with uncertainty without collapsing into it, because they are not only seeing the moment, they are seeing the pattern. Jung found that this ability gave awakened empaths access to a form of understanding that appeared intuitive, but was actually rooted in deep psychological alignment. When faced with complex situations, they could sense what was happening beneath the surface, not through analysis, but through recognition. They were perceiving the archetype at play. And once you see that level, your relationship with life changes in a fundamental way. Events are no longer random. Experiences are no longer isolated. Everything begins to feel connected to a deeper structure. And this can be both stabilizing and disorienting, because it removes the illusion that life is purely controlled or predictable. But it replaces it with something else, a sense that there is meaning even in what feels chaotic. At this point, all 5 abilities begin to operate together. Energetic discernment allows the empath to read the emotional field. Shadow sight reveals what is hidden within that field. Temporal pattern recognition shows where it is heading. Unconscious communication opens direct interaction with deeper layers, and archetypal perception places all of it within a universal context. This creates a form of awareness that is fundamentally different from ordinary perception. You are no longer just reacting to what is visible. You are engaging with multiple layers of reality at once. And while this level of perception can be incredibly powerful, Jung was clear about something most people overlook. It comes with a cost, because the more you see, the more difficult it becomes to participate in a world that operates primarily on the surface. Conversations begin to feel incomplete. Interactions feel limited. You notice discrepancies others ignore. You perceive dynamics that are not acknowledged. And over time, this creates a specific kind of isolation. Not because you withdraw completely, but because you are experiencing something that is not easily shared. You may sit with people you care about and still feel a distance, not emotional, but perceptual. You are aware of layers they are not engaging with. You are seeing patterns they do not recognize. And there is no simple way to translate that. Jung described this as a structural form of loneliness. Not a failure of connection, but a difference in perception. And many awakened empaths at this stage face a decision: to reduce their awareness in order to fit into familiar dynamics, or to accept what they have become and learn how to live with it. Those who attempt the first often experience a sense of internal conflict, because suppressing perception is not the same as not having it. It creates tension, dissonance, and eventually a loss of alignment with oneself. But those who accept it, who stop trying to see less and instead learn how to navigate what they see, begin to experience something else entirely. Not ease, but depth. And that depth changes everything. What Jung emphasized after observing these patterns across decades of work is that these 5 abilities do not emerge separately. They are not skills you can pick and choose or traits you can develop in isolation. They form an integrated system, each one reinforcing and refining the others. Energetic discernment gives you clarity in the present moment. Shadow sight reveals what is hidden beneath that clarity. Temporal pattern recognition shows you where those hidden dynamics are leading. Unconscious communication allows you to engage with those deeper layers directly. And archetypal perception places everything within a larger framework of meaning. Together, They create a way of experiencing reality that is fundamentally different from what most people know. And that difference is not always easy to live with, because the world, in many ways, is structured around surface-level interaction. Social systems depend on partial awareness. Relationships often function within unspoken agreements, not to look too deeply. And when you begin to see beyond those layers consistently, you are no longer participating in the same way. You notice what others ignore, you sense what others dismiss, you understand dynamics that haven't fully revealed themselves yet, and that can create distance, not because you don't care, but because you see more than what is being acknowledged. Jung was direct about this. He did not romanticize the awakened empath. He did not describe this path as something purely uplifting or desirable. He understood that increased perception brings increased responsibility, and often a form of solitude that cannot be completely removed. But he also observed something equally important. Those who accepted these abilities fully, without trying to minimize them, developed a quality of life that was not easier, but significantly richer. Their relationships became fewer, but more authentic. They no longer relied on surface compatibility. They chose connection based on what they could actually see, not just what was presented. Their understanding of people deepened into something that was not naive. They could recognize both light and shadow in others and still choose to connect with awareness, not illusion. Their experience of meaning shifted. They no longer needed to construct purpose artificially, because they could perceive the patterns that give human experience its depth. Even in difficulty, even in loss, there was context. And that context changed how they moved through life. They were no longer trying to avoid discomfort at all costs. They were able to recognize when discomfort was part of a necessary process. They could hold complexity without needing immediate resolution. And perhaps most importantly, they developed a form of trust, not blind trust in outcomes, but trust in their own perception, because over time, they had seen it prove accurate again and again. Jung believed that individuals with this level of awareness served a specific role within the larger human system. They were not meant to dominate or instruct others, but to perceive what others could not yet see. To act, in a sense, as mirrors, reflecting the underlying realities that remain hidden beneath collective behavior. This is why their presence can feel both grounding and unsettling. They do not reinforce illusion. They reveal structure. So if you recognize yourself in these patterns, if your sensitivity has shifted from confusion into clarity, if your perception has become more precise rather than more overwhelming, then what you are experiencing is not something arbitrary. It is the result of transformation, not something you learned, something you became. And according to Jung, that is one of the most demanding and most meaningful developments a human being can go through.